At its peak, Dubai did not feel like a city. It felt like a system that could not fail. Nearly 20 million international visitors moved through it in a single year. Airports operated at a scale few places in the world could match. Capital flowed in from every direction: Europe, Asia, the Middle East, creating the impression of a place where movement never stopped and growth had no ceiling. But what made Dubai powerful was not what it produced. It was what it attracted. Unlike traditional economies built on manufacturing, agriculture, or internal consumption, Dubai engineered something different. A model based on flow. People arrive, they spend, they invest, they leave, and then new people replace them. It does not generate value in the conventional sense, it processes value, and that distinction is critical. Because when a system depends on external input, its strength is also its vulnerability. The more efficient it becomes at absorbing global capital and attention, the more dependent it becomes on those flows continuing without interruption. But at the peak, that dependency is invisible. Everything looks stable. Hotels remain full. Real estate prices rise. Restaurants are busy. Construction continues. Each signal reinforces the same narrative. This system works. And over time, that narrative evolves into something stronger. Belief. The belief that Dubai is not just successful, but structurally immune, that it exists outside the normal risks that affect other regions, that it has somehow engineered stability in a world defined by uncertainty. And that belief becomes the most valuable asset of all, because it drives decisions. Investors allocate capital not just because of returns, but because they trust the environment. Tourists choose the destination not just for luxury, but for certainty. Professionals relocate not just for income, but for predictability. Everything depends on that perception. And as long as it holds, the system expands. Faster, larger, more ambitious. But beneath that expansion, something else is happening. Because systems built on continuous flow are not designed for interruption. They are optimized for movement, which means they perform exceptionally well under ideal conditions and struggle the moment those conditions change. At the peak, that risk is easy to ignore, because success creates confidence, and confidence reduces caution. But that is exactly what makes the system fragile, not because it is weak, but because it is exposed. Exposed to anything that can slow down the flow it depends on. And when that happens, the shift is not gradual, it is immediate, because once the flow stops, everything that depended on it must adjust at the same time. And that is where the illusion begins to crack. The moment the system was tested did not arrive slowly, it arrived all at once. In 2025, Dubai International Airport handled a record 95.2 million passengers, reinforcing its position as one of the busiest hubs on Earth. It was not just infrastructure, it was the beating heart of a global network where movement defined value. But by March 2026, that heart began to slow. Not gradually, abruptly. Within just 3 weeks, more than 37,000 flights were canceled. The cancellation rate surged to an estimated 43.7%, removing millions of available seats from the global travel system almost overnight. And that is where the real shift begins, because airports are not just transportation hubs, they are indicators. When they function smoothly, it signals confidence, stability, predictability. When they begin to fail, it signals something else entirely: uncertainty. At Terminal 3, the crowds were still there. But something had changed. The movement looked the same, but the intention behind it was different. People were no longer arriving with expectation, they were leaving with urgency. Suitcases moved faster. Conversations were shorter. Eyes were fixed on departure boards, not arrivals. The system had not emptied, it had reversed. And that distinction matters, because a system designed to absorb inflow does not automatically adapt to outflow. It becomes strained, compressed, overloaded. At the same time, external forces began to amplify the pressure. Risk insurance costs surged, forcing major international carriers, including British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, to suspend operations. The network that once connected Dubai to the world began to fragment. And when airlines pull back, they do more than reduce capacity. They signal risk, which triggers further hesitation, which reduces demand even more. And that creates a feedback loop. Less confidence leads to fewer flights. Fewer flights reduce accessibility. Reduced accessibility lowers demand, and the system begins to contract from all directions. Meanwhile, alternatives emerge. Private jet prices, normally a symbol of luxury, spiked to as high as $350,000, not as an upgrade, but as an exit strategy. Even more telling, Some individuals chose to leave the city by land, enduring 16-hour journeys across the desert to reach safer departure points in neighboring countries. This is not normal behavior. This is adaptation under pressure, and it reveals something deeper. Because when people are willing to abandon efficiency, comfort, and cost just to exit a system, it means the perceived risk has crossed a critical threshold. And once that threshold is crossed, the system no longer operates under normal logic. It operates under survival logic. And survival logic changes everything, because decisions are no longer optimized. They are accelerated, compressed, driven by urgency rather than calculation. And that is when the system loses its balance, because it was never designed to operate under those conditions. Dubai was built to handle growth, not reversal. To process arrival, not departure. And when the flow that sustained it suddenly froze, the system did not collapse immediately, but it stopped functioning in the way it was designed to. And that is the beginning of systemic failure, not when everything breaks, but when everything starts behaving differently. The first real signal of collapse is never visible in infrastructure. It appears in behavior, and more specifically, in the behavior of those who have the most to lose. In early March 2026, over 80,000 hotel bookings were canceled almost instantly, not rescheduled, not delayed, simply removed from the system. But cancellations alone do not tell the full story, because what followed revealed something far more significant. Movement. At the airport, the crowd remained dense, but the purpose had changed. People were no longer arriving to experience luxury. They were leaving to preserve security, and among them, a particular group reacted fastest: the wealthy. This is not coincidence, because high-net-worth individuals are not just consumers of luxury systems. They are also the most sensitive to risk. They monitor signals earlier, they react faster, and when they move decisively. In Dubai, that movement became visible in ways that were difficult to ignore. More than 2,000 luxury supercars were left behind in airport parking lots, covered in dust, many with keys still in the ignition. This is not just abandonment, it is prioritization. A decision that the value of time and safety had exceeded the value of the asset itself. Because in normal conditions, a multi-million-dollar vehicle represents status, wealth, and permanence. But in moments of systemic stress, those symbols lose meaning. They become replaceable. And that shift reveals a deeper truth. Luxury does not hold value on its own. It holds value only within a functioning system. Once that system is questioned, even slightly, the hierarchy changes. Safety first, liquidity second. Everything else becomes secondary, and this is where panic differs from strategy. Because at the surface, these actions look emotional, abrupt, unplanned, but underneath they are calculated, a reallocation of risk, a decision to preserve what matters most before conditions worsen. At the same time, the cost of exit surged dramatically. Private jet flights reached prices as high as $350,000, not as a display of wealth, but as a tool for escape, and that distinction matters. Because when luxury infrastructure is repurposed for evacuation, it signals something profound. The system is no longer being used for growth. It is being used for exit. And once that transition occurs, the narrative changes instantly, from opportunity to vulnerability. Because wealth, in theory, provides protection, access, mobility, options. But in practice, it depends on the system in which it exists. And when that system becomes unstable, wealth does not eliminate risk. It amplifies awareness of it, which is why the wealthy move first, not because they are afraid, but because they understand. They recognize that systems built on perception can change faster than systems built on production. And when that perception shifts, the window to act becomes small. So they act early, and when enough of them act at the same time, the effect becomes visible, not as panic, but as signal. A signal that the system is no longer being trusted by those who understand it best. And once that trust begins to erode at the top, it spreads downward. Because if the people with the most information, the most resources, and the most flexibility are choosing to leave, then the question for everyone else becomes unavoidable. What do they see that we don't? Once the signal spreads, the next layer begins to shift: value. Because luxury, despite how it appears, is not built on materials. It is built on trust. For years, Dubai's hospitality sector operated as a near-perfect machine. Occupancy rates consistently exceeded 80%. Prices remained high, yet demand continued to match supply. The system functioned because people believed the experience justified the cost. But in March 2026, that balance broke. In just the first week, more than 80,000 bookings disappeared, and occupancy did not decline gradually. It collapsed, from over 80% to below 15% in a matter of days. That kind of shift does not happen in normal markets. It only happens when perception changes faster than pricing can adjust. Because pricing follows logic, perception follows emotion, and emotion moves instantly. At the same time, the financial impact began to accumulate at a scale that revealed how dependent the system truly was. Tourism revenue losses were estimated at up to $600 million per day, not because infrastructure failed, but because demand vanished. And this is where the structure of luxury becomes exposed. Because high-end systems are not designed for emptiness, they are optimized for volume, continuous flow of guests, whilst continuous consumption, continuous utilization of space. When that flow stops, the economics reverse. Costs remain constant. Cooling, maintenance, staffing, energy, these do not decrease proportionally with demand. In fact, they often increase in relative terms, because now the system must sustain itself with less input, which creates a paradox. The more empty the system becomes, the more expensive it is to maintain, and that transforms assets into liabilities. Hotels that once symbolized prestige begin to resemble something else. Empty structures, silent corridors, spaces designed for movement now holding stillness. Even newly opened megaprojects, built to showcase wealth, found themselves facing emptiness almost immediately after launch. Not because they lacked quality, indeed, but because the conditions required to sustain them no longer existed. And this reveals a deeper contradiction. Dubai did not build hotels to meet accommodation demand. It built them as expressions of power, concrete balance sheets, physical representations of economic strength. But when the system that validates that strength weakens, those structures lose their meaning. They remain impressive, but no longer necessary. And this is where the concept of reverse Monaco begins to emerge. A place where luxury exists, but without the stable base of long-term residents or consistent demand to sustain it. A system where high-end assets depend entirely on external flow. And when that flow stops, the system cannot compensate internally. Discounts begin to appear, promotions expand, prices adjust downward. But demand does not return at the same speed, because the issue is no longer affordability, it is confidence. And confidence cannot be restored through pricing. It requires time, consistency, stability, which means the system enters a phase of imbalance. Lower revenue, high fixed costs, decreasing utilization, and rising uncertainty. This is not a temporary slowdown, it is a structural recalibration. Because once people begin to question value, they do not return to previous assumptions easily. They compare, they evaluate, they consider alternatives. And in a global market with increasing options, that comparison becomes decisive. Dubai was never competing on cost. It was competing on certainty. And once that certainty weakens, it enters a different category. A category where it must justify itself not just through image, but through substance. And that transition is difficult, because systems built on perception are not designed to operate under scrutiny. They are designed to be accepted. And once acceptance turns into evaluation, everything changes. When value collapses, the next layer to move is not capital, it is people. Because behind every functioning system, there is a human structure holding it together, not just physically, but operationally. Decision makers, professionals, workers, families, each layer playing a role in maintaining the rhythm of the city. And in Dubai, that structure is unlike almost anywhere else in the world. Approximately 85% of the population consists of expatriates. This is not a traditional city, it is a temporary system, a place where people come for opportunity, for tax advantages, on for growth, and remain only as long as the equation works in their favor. And that equation is simple: income, stability, future. When all three align, the system grows. But when even one begins to weaken, movement begins. In the first quarter of 2026, around 127,000 residency visas were canceled. This is not just a statistic. It is a signal. A silent migration unfolding in real time. Among those leaving were an estimated 40,000 senior professionals and middle managers, the very individuals responsible for operating, managing, and sustaining the system's daily functions. This is not random. It follows a pattern. Because professionals, like capital, respond early. They observe signals, they reassess risk, and when the balance shifts, they move, not dramatically, but decisively. At the same time, Yeah, the consequences begin to spread across the system. International schools report enrollment declines of around 23%. Families are leaving, which means future demand is shrinking. Healthcare systems begin to feel strain, with nursing staff shortages reaching up to 28% within just 3 months. This is not just operational pressure, it is structural weakening, because services depend on people. And when people leave faster than they can be replaced, the system loses its ability to function at the same level. Meanwhile, those who remain begin to feel something else: pressure. The cost of living continues to rise. Inflation reaches levels around 7.2%. Rental prices remain high. Daily expenses increase. And for the middle class, the group that stabilizes most urban systems, the equation begins to break. They are no longer accumulating value. They are sustaining the system, working not to grow, but to maintain. And that is where dissatisfaction begins. Because when effort does not translate into progress, people reconsider their position. Not emotionally, rationally. Is it still worth staying? And when enough people reach the same conclusion, the system begins to hollow out. Not from the outside, but from within. At places like Dubai Mall, the surface still appears active. Lights remain on, stores remain open, movement continues. But beneath that surface, something has changed. Retail sales drop by more than 50%. Not because people are absent, but because behavior has shifted. Visitors are no longer spending the same way. Residents are no longer consuming the same way. Confidence has been replaced by caution, and that changes everything. And that's because cities are not sustained by buildings. They are sustained by participation, by people choosing to engage, to invest time, energy, and money into the system. When that participation declines, the city does not immediately collapse. It becomes quieter, less dynamic, less connected, and over time, less viable. This is the moment when the system loses something that cannot be measured directly: its soul. Because a city without long-term commitment is not a community, it is a platform, and platforms depend on constant inflow. Once that inflow slows, the structure begins to reveal itself: temporary, transactional, replaceable. And that is the deepest shift, because once people stop seeing a place as somewhere to build a future, they begin to treat it as somewhere to exit. By the time capital hesitates, value collapses. Art and people begin to leave. The final layer does not fail. It reveals. Because what we are witnessing is not just a crisis, it is exposure. An exposure of how the system was built, what it depended on, and what it was never designed to withstand. For years, Dubai's real estate market stood as the backbone of its non-oil economy. Towers rose faster than demand could be measured. Prices climbed, not just because of usage, but because of expectation. And expectation was enough. Until it wasn't. By early 2026, that expectation began to reverse. Around the Burj Khalifa, the most iconic symbol of Dubai's ambition, property demand weakened sharply. Prices in surrounding areas dropped by approximately 12% within just a few weeks. This was not a slow correction, it was a shock. At the same time, a major developer saw market capitalization losses reaching up to 26%, as institutional investors began to exit positions rather than wait for further decline. Because once confidence breaks, capital does not negotiate, it withdraws. And that withdrawal reveals something deeper. That much of the value was not anchored in fundamentals, but in belief. Belief that demand would continue, that prices would rise, that the system would sustain itself indefinitely. But belief, once questioned, cannot support valuation on its own. And that is where structural weaknesses begin to surface. For years, Dubai prioritized scale and visibility over integration. The Burj Khalifa itself, despite its engineering achievement, faced infrastructure mismatches. Waste management systems lagged behind design capacity, and leading to long queues of transport trucks handling basic functions. It is a small detail, but a revealing one, because it shows how development was accelerated ahead of coordination, appearance ahead of system, and when conditions are stable, that imbalance is manageable. But when pressure increases, it becomes visible. The same pattern appears offshore. Palm Jumeirah, one of the most ambitious artificial island projects ever constructed, is now facing environmental stress. Geological observations indicate subsidence of approximately 5 millimeters per year. At the same time, flawed seawall design has reduced natural water circulation, creating stagnation in areas surrounding high-value properties. And the market is responding. Property values on the island have declined between 15% and 20%. As owners attempt to exit positions before maintenance costs escalate further. This is where the illusion begins to fully dissolve, because these structures were never just real estate. They were symbols, symbols of control over nature, control over risk, control over limitation. But nature does not respond to symbols, and markets do not sustain narratives indefinitely. When liquidity tightens, even the most exclusive assets lose their function. A penthouse with an ocean view becomes just another unit without buyers. A skyline becomes a collection of maintenance obligations, and the system begins to invert, from growth to preservation, from expansion to containment. At the same time, legal frameworks begin to exert pressure in unexpected ways. Dubai's financial system, long marketed as frictionless and tax-efficient, it carries strict enforcement mechanisms. Bankruptcy, delayed repayments, or bounced checks are not merely financial issues, they are criminal matters, which creates a trap. Individuals cannot easily liquidate and exit without consequences, and those who attempt to do so face restrictions that limit mobility. At the same time, remaining too long outside the country can trigger international tax obligations, exposing global assets. This creates a paradox: stay and face systemic risk, leave and face financial exposure elsewhere. And that is where the illusion of freedom collapses, because what once appeared as flexibility reveals itself as constraint. And constraint, under pressure, becomes visible immediately. Meanwhile, total restructured debt risk is estimated to approach $80 billion, and raising concerns that capital may begin to shift toward competing hubs such as Singapore or Riyadh, because capital does not stay where it is trapped. It moves where it is free. And this is the final layer of exposure, that Dubai was never a closed system. It was part of a global network, and in that network, alternatives always exist, which means loyalty is never guaranteed, only conditional. And once those conditions change, the system must compete again, not just on scale, but on stability, on trust, on structure. And that is the hardest transition, because rebuilding infrastructure is possible. Rebuilding perception is slower. Rebuilding trust is even harder. Dubai will not disappear. Its position remains strategically important. Its infrastructure is still significant. Its ability to adapt should not be underestimated. But what has been exposed cannot be unseen: that a system built on continuous flow must eventually face interruption, that a model built on perception must eventually face reality, and that wealth without foundation is not protection. It is leverage, and leverage under pressure amplifies everything, including risk. Because in the end, the most important lesson is not about Dubai itself. It is about the model, a model that many systems around the world have begun to follow. Build fast, scale big, attract capital, sustain perception, and hope the flow never stops. But what happens when it does? That is the question this moment leaves behind. And it is a question far bigger than one city.